Hey everybody, welcome to another World of Tanks replay. This one's from Torb on the EU server, playing the IS-2, and he's ended up on mines. He's platooned up with MK and Noah Bomber in artillery, an S-51 and Crusader 5.5-inch self-propelled gun. Now, before we really get into things, just to clear something up, because I've seen it pop up a lot of people are claiming that the IS-2 is a Chinese tank, the Soviet tank is the IS, just because of the way it's named in World of Tanks. This is actually wrong. The IS refers to the family of tanks, including the various gun setups that were tried on it, 85, 100mm, and of course the 122. IS-2 is the correct name for the actual tank which entered service with the Workers and Peasants Red Army in 1943. i.e. this one. This is actually a later version, 1944-45, with the one-piece upper armor plate. But IS-2 isn't a Chinese name, it's a correct Soviet name for the tank. But of course, often in documentation they're just simply referred to as the IS because it was, at the time, the only IS tank actually in service. The white paint around the sides of the turret and on the top of it and across are actually identification marks so that friendly aircraft don't attack it. These exact same markings were still used by the Soviet army into at least the 70s and are still used by the Ukrainians today. If you look at the Ukrainian T-64s that are fighting at the moment, a lot of them have the same paint. Like the Bromwell, the Berlin IS-2 is very close to its tech tree cousin, but very slightly better. Has the same gun, same general shape. It has, I think, slightly more hit points, and of course it has a slightly better shape on the frontal glass plate. But other than that, it's very, very similar. Mobility is about the same, gun handling is more or less the same. So if you're good at the IS, you'll be good at the Berlin IS-2. Of course, the same issue with the reticle that happened in the replay I uploaded from Competency is also going on here, so the aim bloom is not this bad on the tank, don't worry. So far Torb's playing things pretty safe, just taking shots from between these rocks when he can. The enemy only got a single medium up the hill, so there's not too much to worry about there. Especially since it doesn't want to actually poke over into the gun of a T-29. And the fact that it doesn't want to push down and shoot Torb in the side gives him plenty of opportunity to engage the enemy tanks in front of him. And of course, in a Tier 7 match, the 122mm D25T of the IS and IS-2, or both IS-2s, including the Chinese variant, it's a monstrous gun. Of course, the KV-3 gets it as well. It's just fantastically powerful. Seeing an opportunity, after the enemy Rudy goes down, Torb repositions to the hill, giving him side shots on these tanks. Unfortunately, he misses the Comet there, which appears to be stock. But he's in a much better position to work from now, and will be able to use that to great advantage. Quick shot there dispatches the Comet, and he begins to shift position to see what he can do about this IS, or perhaps knock some of the tank destroyers off the ridge where they are undoubtedly hiding. Both enemy arty get lit by the charging Su-122-44, which of course also gets this gun, as does the Su-122. There's a lot of 122s roaming around at Tier 7. Tank destroyer finishes one, Torb finishes the second, and the third arty, the Griller, was just lit for a second there, but the Su-122-44's death cloaked it back up. Torb is of course proxied by this IS, so he pulls back and finds a way to work around it. The enemy E25 meanwhile drives face first into Torb's platoon mates. He takes down no bomber. While Torb and the friendly Wolverine focus on finishing off the enemy IS. Now the E25s are going back for more, but there's now a KV-85 coming in to try and help MK. The Wolverine falls victim to the last charge of the enemy IS, but Torb's able to finish it off. KV-85 is actually getting beat up quite badly by the E25, and MK takes a hit, probably from the Griller, trying to rescue it, but Torb's got his back. In fact, it was an enemy tank destroyer that hit MK, not the Arty, my bad. It was this thing, which Torb now preys upon, bringing death from above. Of course, the 122mm gun can actually two-shot most Tier 7 tank destroyers, which makes the IS family tanks a real asset when it comes to dealing with tank destroyer hell camps. And Torb's now sitting on 4,500 damage and 6 kills. Most people would be happy to call it a day there, however Torb's not satisfied with that and wants to actually win the game. He moves through the village, using the buildings as cover and concealment, in case that Stug is still in position. However, he hasn't been spotted yet or shot at, so it appears the Stug's actually moved. Which is good news, because it should leave the Arty wide open to be finished off. A bit of historical trivia: the IS-2 often gets overlooked when it comes to World War II tanks. The T-34 was much more common, and of course people always fawn over the Tiger. In fact, the IS-2, I used to play a lot of Red Orchestra back when the first game was still alive, and the IS-2 was sort of jokingly referred to as the best tank in the world, because the IS-2 would, every match, trounce any Tiger that dared step to it. And people thought this was highly unrealistic and Russian bias and this, that and the other, but if you actually look at historical data, the IS-2 would generally win a long-range engagement with the Tiger, assuming it actually fired first, and this comes down to the winner of a tank engagement usually being whoever fires first. But with that said, the IS-2's gun could knock out a Tiger at a significantly greater range than a Tiger could knock out an IS-2. Despite being small and light compared to any of the German tanks, including the Panther, the IS-2 had a very powerful gun and very good armor. The IS-2 actually, I think only weighs... Actually, I think it weighs about the same as a Panther. It's something like 42 or 43 tons, which is about the same as a Panther. And yet it has significantly better armor and, of course, this massive gun. So that goes to show you... Oh, and it's not as gigantic either. So that goes to show you the sort of complete wastefulness of the German tank design philosophy during the late war period. In any case, Torb just demonstrated very well for us why you should always use automatic fire extinguishers. He would be dead if he had used a manual. He was taken down to 9 hit points by a single fire tick. If he had 2 ticks, he would have been dead. He's now waiting for MK to move up and either engage or spot or distract the Stug. All he needs really is for it to be distracted long enough to move into the cap. He looks for a shot, but he can't get one, so he just moves straight across the open ground to take up a position behind cover here in the cap and try and bait it out. If it runs away and doesn't want to engage him, he'll win by cap. If it comes back to defend, he will hope to win by destroying it. Unfortunately, MK couldn't last forever in an Artie versus Stug, so he goes down to it. But Torb's now sitting quite comfortably on the cap and preparing to defend himself if the Stug decides to come back. Bit of a wait here as the Stug makes its way back over. And it has the misfortune of popping up on the side where Torb's already aiming and gets finished off by a quick shot for 8 kills and 5,000 damage. A lot of people tend to think of the T-55 as the first Soviet main battle tank, but that's not really accurate. The Soviets continued development of heavy tanks after the war. The IS-2 had been a massive success. Its 122mm gun and good armor made it not only fantastic at dealing with German Tigers and Panthers, but also fantastic at blowing the living shit out of fortified positions during attacks on cities, most notably Berlin. And so after the war, of course, the IS-3 was introduced just in time for the victory parade. The IS-4 came along, although they only saw very limited action. Mostly they were deployed along the border with Korea in order to deter any kind of UN attacks into Soviet territory, and also I think they were used in the border conflicts with China, but they weren't really deployed around where the Westerners would see them very much. Following that, of course, the IS-7 became a thing. The IS-7 wasn't entered into production, it was just too impractical, too costly. It was, however, a fantastically advanced tank for its time, and several examples were built, of which there's one in Kubinka, and the Chieftain did a Inside the Hatch video on it recently. Obviously they managed to get the hatches unwelded, because I remember when he first went to Kubinka they were welded shut and they couldn't get into the tank. Soviet heavy tank development continued for a while after that as well. Of course, there's the Object 279, the UFO tank. I'm pretty sure that's the 279. Get a bit muddled with my object numbers. And then there's some of the even later developments, which, of course, some of them led to the IS-8 we know in game, also referred to as the IS-10 or the T-10, which was the last serving Soviet heavy tank. After that thing was introduced, around the sort of mid-50s, they decided that heavy tanks weren't really much of a thing anymore, and it was gradually phased out of service, although I believe they were still in tank units until about the late 60s, early 70s. The Soviets also had a number of experimental heavy tanks, which took the sort of armor layout and mobility of the T-10 and the advanced weaponry of the IS-7 and slapped them into one tank. There were a lot of trial tanks with 130mm guns, and many of them had some form of mechanized loading system. However, by the late 50s, early 60s, the Soviets were trying out a number of new medium tanks. One of these was the Object 430. This would later become the Object 432, which would become the T-64, and then the 434, which was the T-64B. Of course, the T-64, when it was first introduced into service, had the same 115mm gun as the T-62, and already this was starting to make heavies look a bit obsolete. However, where the Soviets would really get their first main battle tank was the T-64A, which was introduced in, I want to say, about 1967-68, and finally married the 125mm D81, otherwise known as the 2A46, to the T-64 chassis, which was a tank that had the protection and firepower of a heavy tank married to the mobility of a medium tank, and also the size of a medium tank. And really, at the point where the T-64 began to enter widespread service, heavy tanks lost all purpose in existing because suddenly you had a much smaller, more compact tank with the same amount of armor, more or less, and pretty much the same amount of firepower. The Soviets suddenly had a tank which could conduct the deep offensive operations of the medium tanks while also providing enormous firepower in support of infantry firing HE rounds. So that's a sort of brief rundown of what happened with heavy tanks. It's why you don't see them anymore, there's just no point to them. Modern MBTs have guns roughly on par with your World War II and immediate post-war heavy tanks. They have about the same armor, if not better, and of course they have much, much better mobility. So when you've got that, there's really no reason to have some gigantic, slow, ponderous thing. Not anymore. Really what killed the heavy tank was advances in gun technology and advances in armor, particularly once the widespread use of laminate armor came about. There was just absolutely no reason to keep them anymore. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. As ever, I'll see you on the next one.